Hi, everybody. My name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 12A live lesson recording for today. Now, today we're going to be working on the John Milton lesson. And what I can tell you ahead of time is that this is a bit of a long one. So you're definitely going to want to take breaks, to pause the video. There's a lot of history and historical information that's attached. So that's the bad news. The good news is after this lesson, there are only two more in this class and you'll be finished. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get started. Here we are. Here we go. And I'm going to get started with slide number 5. Yes. So slide number 5 is the first slide we'll be going over today. Now, we're going to be talking about, like I said, a lot of historical information before we actually get around to John Milton and his work. Just as a reminder, we don't cover the actual reading selections here while reviewing the lesson. We just review the information in the lesson. There will be separate videos going up to prepare to have just readings and explanations of things that are in the text. So be ready to pause before I move on. I'll give you guys reminders and that sort of thing. Okay. So this first section that we're going to need to go over will be quite a bit of a history lesson. And we're going to start with basically the time that Britain was going through, not just while John Milton was alive, but before and a little bit after. It's important to understand the time periods that he was born and operated between to understand why he wrote what we wrote. So bear with me while we go through all of this information. Now, we start with the Civil War and Restoration. So we're talking the mid 17th century. Now, I've given you guys, I've said this over and over in my videos, but just in case, I want to remind you that for century, what you do to figure out what set of years that is you subtract 1 and then put double zeros to the end. So we've got 17th century minus 1, that's 16, and then you add the double zero. So that's the 1600s. So we're in the middle of the 1600s. So during this time, England experienced great political and religious upheaval. At the center of it was King Charles I in England's parliament. So basically, parliament is the government that connects the monarchy to the people. And the way that things were set up in Britain at the time was that the king couldn't just pass laws without Parliament's approval. And this was put in place to stop the monarchy, kings and queens, from abusing their power. So basically, they disagreed about how the country should be governed. So basically, what rules and laws should be put in place. So it tells you here by 1642, we're almost right smack dab in the middle of the century. The two ended up getting into a civil war. So there were two sides to the Civil War. There were the royalists here that supported Charles I. That's pretty easy to remember. If you're a royalist, you support the royalty. And there were the parliamentarians. So the parliamentarians were people who supported Parliament, and they wanted to shift some of the power that the king had to Parliament. They thought that the king had too much to even be fighting with Parliament about some of the things that they were trying to pass. So the end of this war was that King Charles was defeated, him and his Scottish allies. And they give you the name of the battle where he was defeated, the Battle of Preston in 1648. Pretty much, they explain that the parliamentary army was led by a man named Oliver Cromwell. Pretty much, he and his supporters took control of Parliament, and they arrested the people, 45 of them, who supported King Charles, and stopped a lot of people who were in the middle or who also didn't support him from participating in some of the proceedings. So they fought for control over the country and then proceeded to be kind of unfair. And when it comes to, excuse me, my ear was itching. When it comes to war, usually once you win, you have to make sure that you can remain in power. So these were the sort of things that people were doing, that Parliament was doing at the time, to make sure that they could hold on to power after they won the Civil War. They put King Charles on trial for treason. Basically, treason is when you betray your country, or give up information that puts them at the mercy of other forces. So King Charles was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. So they definitely decapitated him. They give you the date for this. This is 1649. It was a public decapitation. And after his death, England was the only big country in Europe without a monarch. So that means without a king or a queen. So Parliament declared itself the country's sole governing body. So they basically said, we're in charge. We don't need a king or queen. That's not what we're doing. We're doing something different. And in 1649, after the execution, Parliament also declared England a commonwealth, or a democratic nation. So they said, we're done with the monarchy. We're not doing that. We're going to be a democratic nation from now on. And in the next slides, we'll see how that goes. Slide number 6, we get to learn about Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell. So they give you his background. We know that he was the head of the parliamentary war. I'm sorry, parliamentary army in the Civil War. So we get to learn a little more about him on these next couple slides. So just overall, they start off by telling you that Oliver Cromwell was the most important figure in the English Civil War and in the era's politics. And he's also one of the most controversial figures in English history. So part of the reason why this is because, one, he wasn't part of the monarchy. He wasn't born into royalty. He didn't have relations to anyone who was in royalty. And if you recall, some of the belief systems in Britain at the time did actually believe that kings and queens were blessed by God to be on the throne. So it was already controversial for him to be fighting the king, although everyone recognized that King Charles was, perhaps abusing his powers and doing things that the people didn't want it. They still believe that only a person blessed by like a holy bloodline in the monarchy or related to the monarchy should take the throne. So it was very controversial for him to basically win the war and overthrow the king. Part of the other reason why he's considered controversial is because of what ended up happening after the war. During the Civil War, he had to conquest Ireland to stop them from potentially rebelling against British forces. And he did that very cruelly. He was also at the head of the parliament after the war that got rid of people who weren't agreeing with him or didn't side with him. So he was definitely known for silencing his enemies, and that was considered very controversial from a number of standpoints. Some of that is just that it's not very Christianly to be that brutal. And some of it is just that it was just considered unfair play overall, just in terms of politics up to that point. But now that we've gone over the overview of him, we get more detail in that second paragraph. We find out that he was a Puritan, and that in the decade leading up to the Civil War, he was one of the most outspoken members of Parliament. Now, if you remember, at this time from like the previous lesson, we talked about the Church of England and how the Puritans became a major group because they wanted the Protestants, who were early Christians, to separate themselves even more from the Catholic Church. And they thought that the Church of England was basically the same as the Catholic Church, just with a couple name changes. And they really wanted the church to stand out and be different from Catholics, even though they worship the same thing. So Cromwell supported those agendas. And he also thought that control of the army should be transferred from the king to Parliament, because usually the army was under the king at the time. He also thought that Parliament should meet every year, regardless of the king's wishes, before the king could dismiss Parliament and say, "Look, listen, I'm doing my own thing. We're not meeting." So he just believed in Parliament having more power and Parliament being run by Puritans, who he thought were the best people to have in charge. So in slide 7, we get, some more information about him. He became an officer in the Parliamentary Army after the fighting broke out for the Civil War in 1642. So basically, he was just so skilled that he became a lieutenant. He became a lieutenant general, actually, which is second in command. They tell you here in parentheses. And he was pretty much renowned, that means well known, for his ability to maintain supply chains and financial support for his army, which is very important. If you can't supply food and money to your army, then you'll basically be starved out by the fighting. But he was really good at being able to reroute those things to keep his army well fed and energized, because the state of your soldiers dictates how well they do when they fight in a war. So there was a point in the Civil War where the fighting stopped temporarily. Cromwell returned to Parliament during that time, and he continued to criticize the relationship between the king and Parliament. So he basically just went deeper into the rabbit hole, and he refused to settle for peace terms and talks with Charles I without having any major changes. He basically was like, nah, this is all or nothing. We're going all in. After the peace subsided, there was fighting again, and he led the Parliamentary Army to victory. And he himself was the person that thought that the king's death was the only way to end the conflict for good. He pretty much said, well, listen, as long as we leave the king alive, he'll be able to inspire people to fight against us. And if we want this nation to be stable, we're going to have to stop that from happening and make it so that people can't even consider putting him back on the throne. If he's not around to put on the throne, then people won't rebel that same way. So he was one of the primary people pushing for execution of King Charles I. Afterwards, of course, even though they weren't supposed to have a king, Parliament chose Cromwell to take over Ireland, and he won that war. So they ended up putting him at the head of Parliament. So the thing is, the way that things happened after the Civil War was kind of weird. Cromwell was in control of the army. And even though the army was the parliamentary army, that's not really how it worked practically. Most of them were loyal specifically to Cromwell. So he actually had a lot of military force to be able to control what was going to happen next. And he straight up was just like, so we're going to get rid of Parliament and do something else. We're going to form a new Parliament. I don't want any of these people. I don't trust them. And because he had an army and nobody wanted to fight him, no one really tried to stop him. Also, a lot of the people left in the country did actually trust him and support him. So no one really fought with him about how to reshape Parliament. So he dissolved it in 1653 after he conquered Ireland. And then he created his own Parliament of handpicked Puritans, pretty much. So he wanted to have a country that was basically run and ruled by the Puritan version of the Christian religion. And they even drafted a new constitution that reflected a belief system that was based on the Christian Bible. Now, I just want to make a side note here that Cromwell is considered pretty controversial for the brutal way that he conquered Ireland. This was covered before. Now, this is just an overview of what happened there. So there's not a whole lot of detail. We're just sort of giving you a summary. But the things that he directed the army to do were actually pretty atrocious. And that's part of the reason why he's considered such a controversial figure, as I noted earlier. So I just wanted to make that note. We don't stop there to get a whole lot of details about that, just because this lesson is just about getting the background for the time that John Milton wrote in. Okay, so now that we're moving on from that, when Cromwell was appointed the head of the new parliament, it was basically suggested to him that he become a constitutional monarch. So they basically tried to sell him being king, but like without being king, pretty much. Cromwell also was against the title of king because he felt like it wasn't very, he felt like it was a temptation to abuse power. So he was like, I don't want to be associated with Charles I. So I'm not going to call myself a king. So he decided that he was going to take the title of Lord Protector. He felt like taking that title would make things different. It would cause people to view him differently instead of just, oh, another guy who decided to be king, who's on the throne for now. And then they give you the date that he was sworn in. He took the title of Lord Protector of England on December 16th, 1653. And even though he was not a king, the title of Lord Protector still gave him most of the powers that kings had when they were on the throne traditionally. He basically had the exact same powers as Charles I, and he didn't move any of them or shift any of them or delegate any of them the way that he said he was going to, or that he thought he was going to. So he basically said, yes, if someone else is king, we definitely need to shift those powers. But when the suggestion was made for him, he was like, I'll keep those, thanks. I'll keep those. But he did have different dreams and goals for being the Lord Protector than a usual king. He wanted to try to rebuild England and create some stability. And he also wanted to create a country that was less morally corrupt than what he viewed the Church of England and the Catholic Church as being. With that being said, he didn't rule peacefully. He pretty much was a tyrant the entire way through, and he's kind of known for that. He raised taxes without the consent of the people, which is the same thing that kings have done in the past. And he also was definitely, again, just as a reminder, one of those people that opted to silence anyone that was against him. So that was another issue. He didn't just send people away or try to pay people off. He was like, we're trying to get people out of here. And that was also very controversial. So he was basically like a king, even though he wasn't called a king. And that was part of the issue with how people view his reign today. On slide 9, we get a little more information about what he did during his Lord Protectorship. His goal was to try to heal English spiritually, like I mentioned before. And he, surprisingly, he actually allowed people to worship as they chose, as long as it was under the Church of England. He also was pretty lax on people who weren't converting. So it says here, he established a liberty of conscience that allowed people to worship as they chose. Under his rule, the Church of England was given more local control, but no one was required to convert. So he pretty much recognized that because there were other types of beliefs that were happening, he didn't want to incite any more fighting. So he was good about that, at least. And he gave greater power to the Puritans, though. So it was very obvious who he thought should be at the top. In 1655, they note that he broke the country up into provinces, and those were under military control. So he pretty much tried to regulate everyone's behavior following the law by having constant military presence. In 1657, he gained even more power. And this is kind of crazy, given his initial goals. He was renamed Lord Protector for life in 1657. So pretty much he and his line were established as kings, so to speak. He even picked his son to be his successor. And it's a good thing he did because he died the year after, or he got sick the year after it died, yes, in September 1658. It says most likely from malaria and kidney infections. Now, the problem with establishing your own monarchy, and what has always been the problem, is that there's no guarantee that your sons and descendants will rule the country as well as you, or the same way that you did. And that was part of the issue with his son. He was not as good of a leader as his father was. And pretty much his son, his name is Richard Cromwell. He lost support from the parliament, and he literally only ruled for a year and a half before he was asked to resign in 1659. So that pretty much just ended the whole Commonwealth right there. Oliver Cromwell was a strong personality and was able to make things happen, but the trust of the people in his son was not good enough to keep that going. So then there's just the issue of all of this being done and for nothing, basically, because things were converted right back to the way that they were. On slide 10, they even tell you, it says restoration and revolution. Basically, Parliament voted to restore the monarchy after his Oliver's son Richard failed to improve the Commonwealth. It says here that George Monk, who was the head of the army that Oliver left, took control of England, and the Parliament voted to restore the monarchy. They literally went to find Charles II, the son of Charles I, and asked him to please come back and be king again, which is a little funny. He was in exile after his father died. They basically said, don't come back here because we don't want you to potentially raise an army or try to change anything. And they went to go find him, and he was crowned the King of England, Ireland, and Scotland in April 1661. So once Charles II started reigning, the period was known as the Restoration. And the reason why it was called the Restoration is because they restored the monarchy. So Charles II pretty much tried to cut back and push back against the Puritanism that had been ruling the land, basically. So the Puritans were gaining power in the beginning of the war and the years that were leading up to the war, which is part of why Oliver Cromwell was able to be so successful. And Charles II kind of recognized that that was dangerous, and he tried to dismantle that. So he passed a lot of anti-Puritan and anti-Catholic laws. He wanted more power back in the hands of the monarchs and not in the religious groups' hands. And despite these laws, England was just so tired of the infighting and losing people that they pretty much tried to keep things peaceful. There weren't a lot of rebellions. People were not trying to push back against what Charles was establishing. And Charles II was considered pretty much well-liked. And he was also known for, it says here, becoming a patron of the arts and sciences. So basically, he pushed money and encouraged people to put money into the sciences and arts. So the Restoration was meant to mark a return to normalcy. That's basically the summary of it here. While he was king, England did do a bit better. There was some colonization and internal trade that increased at the time. And despite that, there were some challenges, though, because I mean, they were just coming out of war. They ended up getting into more fighting with the Dutch in 1665. And then there were other things. The Great Fire of London, which you may have heard about, has been referenced in a couple of the other lessons, especially the Shakespeare related lessons, if you've had other English classes with us here in Milton. And also the bubonic plague broke out during this time. So those things made it so that his rule wasn't entirely successful, but it was definitely more stable than a civil war going on for a long period of time. So on slide 11, we get more information about how things continue to change. That's basically what we're building on here, information about how things were changing over time. So the Civil War happened because of Charles the First clashing heads with Parliament. Oliver Cromwell won the war against Charles the First and took over and tried to make the government and things more about the Puritans. He tried to basically make it so that he was in charge and had the same powers as a king, even though he technically wasn't a king. And then he died, his son took over and couldn't maintain things. So they had Charles II, Charles the First son, come in and take over. That's the summary of all the slides we've gone through so far. So here on slide 11, we talk about who took over after Charles II. After Charles II died, England was ruled by James, who was Charles's brother. And James was Roman Catholic. Now, in previous lessons, we were sort of talking about how there was a back and forth between the kings and queens on whether or not they were Catholic or if they were Protestant, and how juggling that changed the politics for people who were living there. So again, we're going from someone who was pushing back on Puritan power to James, who was Roman Catholic. So if you were Roman Catholic, you were kind of against the Puritans as well, even if it was for different reasons. And it did become an issue. It says here his religious background became another source of tension. And in the late 1670s, because Charles II was so liked, people even accused the Catholic Church of planning to murder Charles II so that England could have a Catholic king again. So there was big problems with this. Basically, that rumor set off a lot of like hate campaigns against the Catholics, and a lot of people were executed. And these events were basically what contributed to the formation of the two biggest political parties in Britain, the Whigs and the Tories. So the long story short here is that the Whigs opposed the monarchy, so they were against the kingship, and the Tories supported it. And basically, even though Charles II was a king, there was overall more support for him, especially because when the Whigs and Tories started going back and forth, it occurred to basically the common people that Parliament might have become too powerful. So just to reflect, at first, people were concerned that the monarchy was too powerful, and that's what started the Civil War. But afterwards, after Oliver Cromwell had Parliament take over and he handpicked his own people for Parliament, it began to sway in the other direction, and people were afraid that Parliament had too much power. So we get a little more information in paragraph 2 about King James II, who took over after King Charles. So we know that he was disliked already. We just went over that. And because he passed some laws that were pro-Catholic, after all of this happened, he lost even more popularity. So it got to the point pretty much where a bunch of Protestant nobles they basically asked the King William of Dutch to invade England. They pretty much said, listen, we've already been through a lot. We've had a whole civil war about having religious parties in place, and we don't even like Catholics for the most part. The entire point of having a Protestant church and having the Puritan groups form was because the Catholic Church was corrupt. And even if our church has some issues, it's not the same as the Catholic Church. It's better. So we don't want anyone who's Catholic in charge. So if you would please just like invade our country so that we can put you on the throne, because we like you better instead and you're not Catholic. That is generally what happens. They note here they wanted him to rule alongside his wife Mary, who was James the first daughter and heiress to the throne. So basically, Mary was James the second's sister. And they said, oh, well, she has a right to the throne since they're related, and we don't like this guy. So if you could just please invade us and bring your wife along so that you could be our king and not be Catholic, that would be great. And the only condition that they put on them was that they rule under a Bill of Rights that transferred some of the monarchy's power to Parliament. Now, this is even after people thought Parliament might be becoming too powerful. They still wanted to transfer some of that power anyway. William and Mary actually agreed. And because there was no support for James on the throne, he just actually decided to flee and exile himself. So William and Mary arrived in 1688, and they took the throne together in 1689, and this was after the Bill of Rights was passed. So this Bill of Rights established basic rules for royal succession, so to clear up what order people succeeded the throne in, and they figured that that would stop a lot of the fighting that had happened in the last couple of decades and bring about some lasting stability. All right, that is a lot of information. So now that we have all of that down, we can finally get around to talking about John Milton, because he grew up during these times while things were changing. So before we get into John Milton, if you need to, we're on slide 14. We still got quite a bit to go. Take a breath, take a break, pause the video, go get some water, use the bathroom, and then come back. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the section on John Milton. So we get information about his life, because a lot of his life affected what he wrote and how he wrote things. We're going to go over a little more of his life events than we do for some of the other authors in these summaries, because I want to make sure that you guys don't pass over information that's actually important. So his life spanned the English Civil War, the Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell, and the Restoration. He made it through all three of those things. So his life was pretty much defined by a Protestant faith that was changing over time. Like, remember, they went from basically just a religious sect to being the head of the government to collapsing government and trying to figure out what the right balance was with Charles II during the Restoration. So because of that, John Milton was quite a few things during his lifetime. They give you a list here. He was a devoted student, a political agitator during times of war, a pamphlet writer, and a religious radical. But he was pretty gifted and he was in the public eye. So basically from a very young age, he was viewed as very intelligent, very well read and spoken, educated, and his writing was considered to be great. So in the second paragraph, we get the start of the summary of his upbringing. So he was born in 1608. His family was Protestant and they were middle class. So he was surrounded by a lot of culture and religion from a young age. And he was a scholar of language from a young age. They give you some of the languages that he studied: Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and many modern European languages. These are what he studied before he went to a boarding school called Christ's College in Cambridge, which is like where all of the middle and upper class people went to learn. He wrote some of his well-known poems even during this time while he was at school, and they give you a list of those. On Shakespeare, L'Allegro and Il Penseroso. And those are three of the writings that he did that we're going to be going over today. And then at the bottom, we get some of his attitude towards writing and how writing affected his life. He thought that poetry should be written for spiritual enhancement and that it should help people understand God and become better Christians. And He tried to prove this through studying himself. After he left Cambridge, he dedicated himself for 6 years of independent religious study. And he also brushed up on lots of other things. He read philosophy, science, classical Greek, and Roman mythology. So even though he was religious, he thought that it was very important to understand the past and how that affected people writing up until pretty much up until his death. He thought that it was important to just be well educated so that you could understand and pick the best things out of the cultures that existed before. It notes here right at the very end, his interest in classical works reflects the influence of the emerging neoclassical style in literature. So we went over the neoclassicism movement in the last lesson. We did like an overall glimpse of it. We're going to get more specific about it in the next couple lessons, but this just wants you to know that he was a part of the beginning of that movement, and you could start to see the influence that his education had on him in that direction even early on. They tell you he toured Europe, and more importantly, they give you information about how he participated in the English Civil War because he was in England at the time that it was happening. He wrote political pamphlets that supported the Puritans and Parliament. So he was definitely a supporter of the parliamentary group. He was also a supporter of Oliver Cromwell, and Cromwell named Milton Secretary of Foreign Tongues. So he was in charge of translating foreign correspondence, so that's letters and communication, to and from Latin. And Milton also wrote a lot of propaganda in defense of the Commonwealth. So he was definitely he was using his stardom, basically being well known for his writing, to convince people that forming the Commonwealth with Oliver Cromwell was the best thing for the country. So some of these works included, in his celebrated defenses of the English people. And he wrote the Areopagitica. And that's one of his most famous pieces. So it was basically a pamphlet against censorship. They give you a summary of it. And this was kind of, even though Cromwell was in fact silencing his detractors and people who were against him, at the same time, he did let people worship however they wanted in the country. So Milton writing a pamphlet against censorship makes sense during this time. It says he also published writings in defense of divorce and the subject of marital happiness. Now, this is kind of a throwback to the previous lesson. Now, if some of you remember, the entire reason why the Church of England was formed was because Henry VIII wanted to be able to divorce one of his wives, and the Catholic Church wouldn't let him. So he basically said, that's fine. I'll form my own church where I can get divorced. This pamphlet was basically in defense of that specific practice and people being able to be allowed to get divorced and why that should be allowed. Now on slide 16 here, we get more information about some of the events that he lived through and how he reacted to it. In the Commonwealth era, he suffered a lot of personal tragedies. He had a son that died young. He had a tragedy where his wife at the time died giving birth to their youngest daughter. And on top of that, around that time in 1652, when his wife died, he started to lose his sight. He was completely blind 2 years later in 1654. He did manage to get remarried in 1656, but his second wife also died from complications after childbirth. And the child that he had with her also died. So this is just all bad. This whole section of his life was just really awful. And things got even worse when Cromwell died and the Commonwealth of England collapsed after his son tried to take over. So basically, Milton had put all of his faith in Cromwell's ability to have a solid vision for the future of England, and it just sort of collapsed. And basically, over the time that he was serving Oliver Cromwell, he kind of grew a little more and more crazy about the Commonwealth and Puritans being in charge of everything. So when it all collapsed, he was kind of forced to look at what he had done and what he had gained by supporting Cromwell during that time. And he ended up deciding that he couldn't really trust any organized religious groups, and he went into isolation after this. He had the help of an assistant to write things even after he lost his sight. So basically, he would dictate to them and then they would write down what he said. He did support the Puritans, but still, he supported the Puritans because that was his religious sect. But in terms of Cromwell, what he did and how that worked out, his faith was a little broken about that. He was punished a little bit for his part in Cromwell's government, but mostly he was just imprisoned for a brief period of time. So they sent him to jail for a short time, and they took a lot of his property and his money and stuff. And some of the more radical people burned some of his pro Cromwell writings. But for the most part, he escaped with his life. He wasn't executed or anything like that. And he was pretty much given grace when he was tried for those matters because he was such a prolific writer. People appreciated his writing so much that they were like, okay, so we know that you supported this guy, and this guy was crazy. He did some crazy stuff, and his whole Commonwealth fell apart. But you didn't just support him. You also gave us good works that showed us that you have kind of a level head, I guess, except for this. So we're just going to put you in jail for a bit and take some of your money. Is that cool? And he was like, well, I mean, I get to be alive. So, so basically after he got out of prison, he withdrew to do solely religious study, and he did end up getting married again in 1663. Now, this is the section on slide 17 where we get into more information about how he felt about organized religion after this. So he definitely felt betrayed after everything that happened with Oliver Cromwell. He still considered himself a Puritan because he believed in God, the Holy Trinity, and the idea of humanity being sinful and having to work to get into heaven. He believed in all of those things still. So he didn't leave the religion, but he didn't trust the institutions. He basically came to realize that he was kind of used for his writing ability, and he considered organized religion corrupt across the board. He basically said, it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Protestant or Puritan. If you're in an organized group, the only reason why that can exist is to take advantage of you. So he thought that personal prayer, or eventually he began to think that personal prayer was the only way for people to truly know and follow God's will. Now, there were a small number of people who also thought this at the time, but he was probably one of the first prominent figures or celebrities, if you will, of the time that thought this. So he did have a lot of influence over that practice. And if you've noticed, today, the Christian religion does actually operate on a lot of that premise. It is important to follow the procedures that are in the Bible, but a lot of people feel like personal prayer is the true path to salvation. So that started here. And then they get into a little more of his religious views in his older years. He also thought that humanity was flawed, just like a lot of Puritan writers. And that's one of the things that makes its way into neoclassicist writings. But unlike other Puritans, he thought and argued that people would be allowed into heaven if they actually worked to do God's will while they were alive. And he presents that message in Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is actually his biggest work. It's the most important. It's a full novel, so we're not going to cover it here in this lesson, but we are going to go over some information from it that's important and reflects on Milton's religious thoughts and feelings. So we get information about this at the bottom. Milton published Paradise Lost in 1667. And it was pretty much immediately recognized as a great work of English and religious literature. They pretty much considered it to be the Protestant counterpart of the Divine Comedy. So the Divine Comedy is basically by Dante. It's famously known for describing the different circles of hell on a journey. It's the novel and epic poem that a lot of the modern media around hell is centered around. If you've ever played the actual game Dante's Inferno, it was based on that poem. And there are allusions to it and lots of other games that have to do with hell, suffering, and that kind of thing. He wrote that to be the Christian counterpart, since the Divine Comedy is mostly Catholic. And he published 2 more poems after Paradise Lost, before his death in 1674. So even though he was blind at this point, he was basically writing and publishing works for decades after he went blind. And a lot of his later work showed the changing influence of the Renaissance and the Reformation on English literature. So that's one of the reasons why he's considered so important. He lived through this sort of difficult and somewhat magical time. And because of that, you can see the influences of those times in his work across all those years. And not only that, but he was also very good at writing and very articulate. So there's a lot of cultural information that you can get from looking at his writing. Okay. So now that we've gone through all of that, that was about 5 slides worth of information just about Milton as a person. We're going to try to get into a lot of his writings. So he was definitely one of the most learned poets of the English language, for sure. And we talked about how much schooling he went to. He was schooling for years and years, learning lots of different languages and religions and how they worked. Those influenced his writing. And he was also influenced by the neoclassical style that was popular during like his younger days. And because he was influenced by the neoclassicism movement, that means that he had a lot of Greek and Roman influences in his stories. And that part of that is shown by the fact that he even decided to write Paradise Lost, because epic poems were definitely a Greek and Roman literature thing. So he wanted to write his own modern, at the time, version of that. So on the right here, we have a table that says early neoclassicism. So basically the time where he was writing most of his stories, here's what neoclassicism was. So they give you a list here. I would advise you very strongly to try to put this in your notes, and I'm going to go through and try to describe some of these things so that you have like an understanding of what they are. So pretty much we are just going to start from the top. So the common forms that are listed here are allegories, epigrams, and early novels. So pretty much allegories are forms where you basically everything in the story is representative of a concept. We've had this come up in some of the previous lessons, but pretty much an allegory is when the characters and the names and the settings of your stories all represent something else. So they represent an idea. We're going to go into this in a little more detail later when we go over some of Milton's stories. Epigrams are short poems that expresses an idea in a funny, satirical, witty kind of way. So like you're sort of criticizing something, but in a short, witty way. Like think of if you could make a poem into like a joke that criticizes someone, like an expose sort of thing, that would be an epigram. And then early novels here. So the types of long stories that were written during the neoclassicism age was like the early blueprint for the novels that we have today, the big chunky books that are broken up into chapters and the like. The prose style, remember that prose means written stories. So there are two big categories for writing. One is prose, which is when you write something out normally, sentences, paragraphs, and all of that. And then there is poems, and we all know what poems are. Those are short form, line by line. Sometimes you'll have stanzas, but they're not always complete sentences, that kind of thing. So the prose style, that means like the normal writing style, was clear, concise, that means short and straight to the point. They were rational, so they were logical. They were skeptical, so they questioned things. They were well organized and plain. Now remember that this was part of the influence from the Puritans, who felt like it made more sense to be straight to the point, and that more creative styles or basically just to confuse people and stray them away from God. They felt like it was important to be straight to the point so people could understand why worshiping God was important. So that was the style that they wrote in. The poetic style was strongly rhythmic. So basically they had certain meter patterns, syllable patterns that they went into. And this is carrying over from like Shakespeare's age. It says here they were balanced, they were witty, so they pointed out clever things, and they featured a lot of classical allusions. So that means a lot of references to the Greek and Roman stuff that we were just talking about. And then for influences, of course, the classical Greek and Roman forms, we just talked about that, and the new Protestant sects. So since the Protestant sections, that's what sects is short for, since the Protestant sections of the new Church of England were taking over, they were writing a lot of literature about their faith. So that influenced a lot of things at this time because it was becoming more and more popular, so popular that they were able to have a civil war about it. And the early neoclassicism was a response to the changing social hierarchy and the Renaissance. So written in response to everything that was going down with Oliver Cromwell, his son, and the labeling of Charles the second as the new king, all of those things. All right. So they make a note here. Because Milton's work is from the early neoclassical movement, it doesn't fit super neatly. He's kind of like one of the, not one of the pioneers, but one of the people who got into it early on after it took off. So not everything that he writes fits neatly into the category. And because he lost or had differing opinions from some of the other Puritans, some of his work just differs. He had a high level education, so he used a lot of complex syntax or sentence structure, which was different from the clear and concise neoclassical stuff. And also he focused on a lot of spirituality because of his Puritan influence and Protestant influence. Instead of asking rational questions. He was a deeply religious person. So even though he had influence from the neoclassicism movement, he wasn't completely there in so far as his work goes. And lastly, the thing that makes him a little different is that he does draw from Roman and Greek sources, but he also references the Bible and other great English works. So basically, because he wanted to write an epic, especially with Paradise Lost, and he was so well read, he was able to reference even things so far back as Geoffrey Chaucer which we covered earlier on in the course, and Edmund Spencer, who we also covered earlier on in the course. So he was able to reference early English stuff. So basically, he was not a neoclassical writer in the strictest sense, just because he was influenced by so many things. Yes, a lot of his writings had the hallmarks of neoclassical writings, but since he was in the very beginning of the movement, he was able to be influenced by his education, by his religion, and that made his writing a little different. Okay, so now we have an entire section on understanding Milton. And I know that this is important because it's going to be rough for a lot of you. I think the fact that his sentence structure is not exactly plain English, there's a lot of moving sentence sections around, it's going to be a little difficult. So they talk about that on this slide, and they also talk about enjambment, and they give you the definition of that. So enjambment comes from the French word meaning straddling, and it refers to clauses or sentences that don't end at the end of a line, but continue to the next line. So basically, whenever you're reading a poem and you notice that a sentence isn't all in one line, it's cut off and it continues on to the next line. That's what enjambment is. That's basically what they said here in fancier language. So if you have a sentence that goes to a certain point in a line and then stops and continues on the next line, instead of all being on the same line, it's enjambment. Now, the important thing for this is that this is how it works for poetry. There's a difference between enjambment when you cut a sentence off in the middle and when you're just normally typing and a sentence runs on into the next line. So there's a difference between the enjambment that we see here, continuing here, and this sentence here continuing here. When we get to the end of a line on a page, there actually is just no more room unless you want it to go off into the edge, right? So it goes to the next line. That's a formatting thing, just so that you can read it without the sentence running on forever and you having to scroll from left to right forever. But in a poem, when you're using enjambment, you cut it off on purpose. So like, for example, one or more lines from here could be continued all the way down the page, all the way down to right here, but it isn't. Because the person who wrote this poem, Milton, decided that he wanted to put emphasis on certain lines and that he wanted the syllable patterns to fit like classical patterns, he cut these sentences off and chose his words carefully so that there was a certain type of rhythm. So just to give you an example of that rhythm, I'm going to go ahead and read through this section, an example, and then we'll look at the explanation at the bottom. It says, this is from Paradise Lost, and it's describing Adam. So it says, his fair large front and eye sublime declared absolute rule, and hyacinth locks round from his parted forelock many hung clustering, but not beneath his shoulders broad. So there is basically a pattern of how the syllables sound here. His fair large front and eye sublime declared. So there's sort of a rhythm of these syllables being long and short in these lines. And he cuts them off on purpose to sort of put emphasis on which words start each line and to keep that rhythm in each line. But more importantly, enjambment here emphasizes the list-like quality of his description of Adam. So this is a list. His large front and eye sublime declared absolute rule, and hyacinth locks round from his parted forelock many hung clustering, but not beneath his shoulders broad. So on every line, we've got something different that we're describing here. And instead of putting it all together, breaking it up makes it feel a little more like a list. Like, it's important to remember when you're reading poetry that it's not just about how it sounds, it's also how it looks to your eye. Your eye and your brain picks up on those patterns, even if you don't think they do. So listing front and eye sublime declared, we've got hyacinth locks Hyacinthine is like a type of flower. Round from his parted forelock, many hung. So we've got hair being described and aspects of his hair, how it's hanging, where it's hanging. And they're giving us a description of Adam, and breaking it up this way just makes it seem more like a list instead of just one sentence describing his hair. We're describing the color, how it hangs, how long it is. And by breaking it up, that sounds more like a list. And then it says here, ending sentences or phrases in the middle of the line rather than at the end adds more pauses, and this tactic makes the list seem longer when you read. Alrighty. So now we get to talk about the syntax. So the syntax is the sentence structure. So they tell you pretty much up front here. Milton often places words in an entirely different order than we are used to in modern English. So basically that sort of olden English type of format is what he uses here. So it's important to look at the way that he writes the sentences to help you understand. So it says this choice is often attributed to the influence of Latin on his work because the way that sentences in Latin are formed are different. Usually you don't get the subject at the beginning. You get like the adjectives and things first, then you get the subjects. So, and it says that he wrote a lot of his early poems in Latin, which has no set order for sentences. So they give you that information. It's important. He wrote a lot of his early works in Latin, which had no set word order for sentences. So they give you an example of this here in these two lines. When Satan still in gaze, at first he stood, scarce thus at length, fallid speech recovered sad. So they give you a modern translation of this. And what helps is if you know what some of these words mean. So fallid, just to give you it basically just means fallid speech is speech that you've lost. And let's see. We've got, I think that's the most complicated word that's in here. So they give you a rewrite of this. We've got scarcely had this finished with Satan. When Satan, who was still gazing as he had when he first stood, recovered the speech he had lost and spoke sadly at length. So the order here is kind of messed up. He's reversed the order of these lines in quite a bit. So we've got at first he stood, right? We've got scarce thus at length. So the scarce here basically is just saying he had barely finished, right? So he barely had finished when Satan, who was still gazing, so that means looking at first, like when he first stood. And then he recovered the speech he lost and spoke. So recovered is here at the end. And then we have fallid speech, which is speech that's lost. So if you were reading this and you didn't have the translation, I think that the easiest way would be to try to read sections that seem like they go together and try to break them apart. So we have scarce thus at length, fallid speech recovered sad. So fallid is a difficult, failed is a difficult word just because like it's not spelled the way we would spell it today. So failed speech means he's not talking. He lost his ability to speak. So it says at length, failed speech recovered sad. So failed speech recovered means that he had lost his speech, and thus at length means that he's going on at length. So he had lost his speech and wasn't sure what to say, but when he went on, he spoke sadly. So the scarce comes into play up here. So when Satan still in gaze, at first he stood scarce. So when he had barely finished standing, Satan was still in a gaze, pretty much. And I think that that's a rough translation that's closer to what they offer here. We're going to try to go over, again, there's only some sections from Paradise Lost here. You're not going to have to read like a long excerpt from Paradise Lost. But we're just giving you examples of how difficult it is to interpret this because of how it was written in Latin. At the time that he was writing this, this was okay. This was something that if you had like an average education, you would be able to understand. Okay, so we get more examples here. Understanding Milton's complex syntax is one of the most important parts of reading his poetry. It may be necessary to reread a stanza that's like a poem with, a paragraph within a poem, or poem itself 3 or 4 times to comprehend the words. So they give you another example here. Nor gentle purpose nor endearing smiles wanted, nor youthful dalliances as beseems fair couple linked in happy nuptial league alone as they. So basically, this is supposed to describe Adam and Eve's time in the garden. And if you rewrite it, they give you the example here. They did not lack easy conversation or endearing smiles. Endearing means like to charm someone towards you. Or youthful flirtation that is fitting for a fair couple who were happily married and alone as they were. So just looking at this, we have nor gentle purpose, nor endearing smiles. That's easy enough. They basically were not, actually, I think this is easier if you continue on to the next line. So nor gentle purpose, nor endearing smiles wanted. So when you want something, that means that you desire something. There's something you're missing that you want. So by saying nor gentle purpose, nor endearing smiles wanted, what they're telling you in that section is that they did not want gentle purpose is like easy conversation or interaction. So they were not in need or not wanting endearing smiles, that sort of easy conversation, that good company. Gentle purpose, they translate it here as easy conversation, but it's basically good company if you translate it directly. But they tell you, note that gentle purpose means conversation. So since they're giving you that definition, it makes sense to put that here. So they were not wanting any of those things. So they have it. They're not lacking easy conversation, endearing smiles. So then we go to the next line here. It says, nor youthful dalliances as beseems fair couple. So this nor, again, we've got or endearing smiles. So this nor here just adds on to it. It says they also, or they didn't also need youthful dalliances. So the dalliances are like flirting. That's like when you're flirting. So that's how you would, I think that the easiest way would be to look up dalliances if you were reading this on your own. If you do look up dalliances, I can actually, I'm going to pull it up just to see. So dalliances definition. And when you put that in, you get casual romantic or sexual relationship or like involvement with someone. So this is like basically flirtation, romance, that kind of thing. And then we've got some other, like this is Middle English, so we know that this is the age that it came from. So yes, they are not lacking easy conversation, endearing smiles, or youthful flirtation, romance. Um, and it says as beseems. Beseems is just an older version of seems. Beseems makes it more present tense. So as beseems, it means as fitting, as befitting a fair couple. And that's pretty much the definition that we have here. So if you take your time and you make sure to look up some of the words that you're having a hard time with, I think that you can translate this. To get through the rest of it, linked, even though it's spelled with a T, we can guess what that is. It's basically the older form of ED. So linked in happy nuptial league. So nuptial league is basically just a fancy creative way to say they were married. So the same way that we could say like join together in union instead of marriage, like when we're giving speeches, this is basically his way of saying that, just fancy in a poem. Now, this is one of the easier passages to translate because a lot of these words are ones that you actually can look up. Gentle purpose is the most difficult part of this. But if you were to look up nuptial, beseems, dalliances, endearing, that's a word that's used today, you can find those easily looking them up yourself. And this is what makes older words hard. You have to be able to learn the words that are in them to understand. So hopefully going through that in a little more detail has helped explain like why he switches or at least the things that he did switch around that makes this harder. And it says here, even at the bottom, Milton's allusions, that means references to things, and syntax enhances poetry, even though they make its reading more difficult. His unique phrasing and complex metaphors are part of why his writing is so well respected to this day. And the same thing could be said about Shakespeare, for example. Shakespeare made up a lot of the terms that we use in writing today. Okay. Speaking of Shakespeare, our first work by Milton is going to be on Shakespeare. Since we've made it to slide 24, I am going to suggest that you guys take a pause here. We learned a lot about the difficulty that people have in reading Milton. So pause the video here, take another break, go to the bathroom, get yourself some water, and settle in because we're in the home stretch. At this point, we're pretty much going to look at his writing directly and take a look at some of the things that were directly influencing his writing based on the culture at the time. So we've gone through what culture influenced him as a writer, and then we're going to go over some of his works, what they mean, and some of the references that are in them so you understand what was happening at the time. All right, welcome back. So we're starting with slide 24, which is on Shakespeare. This was his first published work, and it was written in 1632. And this was as an introduction to a collection of Shakespeare's plays. Now, what's interesting about this is that a lot of the Puritans were not approving of plays, even though they were popular, because they felt that those were creative expressions that encouraged sin and were not godly. But Milton was very well learned and he appreciated that sort of high elevated writing and Shakespeare's works in general. So he definitely was a fan. Originally, this poem was entitled An Epitaph on the Admirable Dramatic Poet W. Shakespeare. So that's like a long, noble introduction. It says, Milton compiled this tribute early in his career while studying at Cambridge. As you recall, we talked about his education. He definitely learned a lot of languages before he went to Cambridge and then studied some more. It says here, yep, it was not typical of the times because Puritans viewed fiction and drama as sinful and even deceptive. So now we have the excerpt here for on Shakespeare. So take a couple moments to attempt to read that. I want to take this moment to remind you that if you are having a rough time with the readings, try to go through as best as you can If you just don't understand anything at all, feel free to call me or Kathy Vahovic, the other tutor, and we can spend a tutoring session going over the readings with you. Some students have an easier time if they go through like this lesson first and hear some information about the poem and then go back and read it a second time. So if that's you, stay tuned. If that's not you, then don't be afraid to ask for tutoring. Now this paragraph, the second paragraph on this slide, number 24, talks about some of the allusions and references in the poem. So he alludes to the English poet Edmund Spenser and On Shakespeare. And he also alludes to, that means refers to, the Greek muses and Apollo, the god of poetry. So the entire point of this poem was that he wanted to establish that artists are made immortal by their work. So art lasts forever. Even if you die, if your works touch people, then you live on. And this idea was very popular during the Elizabethan age. And he talks about how Shakespeare's greatness is that he wrote spontaneously and naturally. So he talks about how important it is for artists to produce art and how that helps them live forever. And then he specifically talks about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare's artistry came to him naturally. He had a natural talent, instead of people who labored over slow endeavoring art. So that's people who basically had to try hard to copy him. During the Elizabethan age, another thing that was valued was also being able to just be naturally good at art. So a lot of the ideas in the On Shakespeare poem is more about that time, the Elizabethan time, than Milton's time with neoclassicism. And I mean, I feel like you could guess that just based on the fact that he's writing about Shakespeare. We get a little more information about the poem and how he wrote some of what's in it. Basically, he uses rhyming couplets, and we get a couple definitions here about what masculine rhymes are and what feminine rhymes are. So masculine rhymes, just to give you the definition, are where only the final syllable is rhymed. So here we've got an example. What needs my Shakespeare for his honored bones, the labor of an age and pile stones? So it's the owns here that rhyme. However, one of the last couplets in this poem uses a feminine rhyme, and then they give you the definition of that. So a feminine rhyme is a rhyme where the last two syllables rhyme, and then they give you an example. We have, then thou our fancy of itself bereaving, dost make us marvel with too much conceiving. So here we have an eaving sound, eaving, that's two syllables, and then we have eaving here as well, as opposed to bones, stones. So the reason why they're pointing this out is because Milton uses masculine rhymes in most of the poem, but the very last one has a feminine rhyme. And there's a reason why he did that. Most scholars think that the important reason why he did this is because it shows that these lines are different. It should be emphasized without breaking the rhyming pattern of the poem. So it's a very subtle way to tell you, hey, these lines are important because they're the last ones. Instead of breaking them off completely and like changing the feel of the poem or creating like a drastic break. So it's sort of a subtle emphasis. Okay, we're gonna hop over to slide 27. Now slide 27 is L'Allegro and Il Penseroso. L'Allegro and Il Penseroso were written around the same time that he wrote On Shakespeare. And the reason why they're being presented together is that it's important for them to actually be read together. So basically, they explore two different lifestyles um, from the perspective of two different people that are supposed to balance each other in a way, and show you the nature of people on two sides of a similar coin. Now, the word l'allegro means cheerful person in Italian, um, and it describes happy scenes. And the term il penserioso, which he based the title of the poem on, means thoughtful, pensive person. So basically, Il Penseroso describes a scholarly, pensive life. Now, the definition of pensive is thoughtful. If you are pensive, you are thoughtful in a reflective sort of way. You are self-reflecting on your memories and your experiences. It's like deep internal thought. So the point of having these two poems together is that they are from opposite perspectives, someone who is happy and only wants happiness, and someone who wants deep, thoughtful, sometimes sadder existence, is that he wanted to point out that the life of a cheerful person is just as meaningful as that of a pensive person, and vice versa. So he's basically saying, hey, look, I know that some people think that people who are happy are silly or don't care about things, or that people think that thoughtful scholars are pessimistic and negative, but actually they're both very important. So take a moment to read the excerpts from these poems, and then you can meet me on slide 28, which is going to actually be a video about these poems to give you a little more information. All right, so I'm not going to record and watch this video here. You're going to have to take those 6 minutes and 11 seconds to watch the video for yourself to move on to the next slide. But I will cover some of the major points that you should look out for in the video. So they go over the meanings of both of these poems. L'Allegro celebrates mirth and basically says we should push away melancholy. So this is the attitude of a person who doesn't want anything sad in their life. There are references to Greek figures of mirth and happiness, and it describes like bright sunny scenes. There is a joyful tone. There's bright colors that get referenced, and there are references to hens and roosters, since those are considered morning birds in this poem. Now, Il Penseroso does literally the opposite of all of those things. So it celebrates melancholy, or like deep internal like sadness and thought. So it's not just melancholy, it's the subdued feeling of you reflecting upon yourself. And that's important to remember. It calls on the Greek figures, Melancholia, who is just the goddess of melancholy directly. It describes a lot of nighttime scenes, a lot of darker colors. It has a tone, and like the words that are used are more considered like neutral or sad. And instead of hens and roosters for daytime, we get a reference to the nightingale for nighttime. And also, it's important to keep in mind that we get tetrameter couplets. So basically, we get 2-syllable pattern that repeats 4 times. So there's 8 syllables per line, and that's in both of these poems. So both of these poems are rhythmic. They have the same rhythm, they have the same structure, and they were made this way because you were supposed to compare them side by side. Another thing that we get covered in this video is information about the 4 humors. Now, I'm not going to go over that too much because it is in the video, but I'm going to strongly encourage you to take time to pause on the graphic that's there. There's going to be a chart about the 4 humors, and it's basically what we would consider, I would say, almost like zodiac or personality type thing, maybe blood types, yes. So in the East, there are personalities, especially in Asian countries, personalities that are associated with the different blood types, whether or not you're a morning person, if you're very defensive, outgoing, internal, that kind of thing, introvert. So the four humors was basically an older version of this belief that was popular during the time that Milton was alive and stretches all the way back to the Egyptians. So they give you information about this. Make sure to write down that chart and label it. Because it explains some of the references that are in the poem. In fact, I actually think it's a good idea for you to read, or I'm sorry, for you to watch this particular video and then go back to read the examples and excerpts from Le Allegro and Il Penseroso. I think that that would help a lot with the references if you went over this first. If you've already read it already, that's perfectly fine, but understanding the humors and seeing the notes that are in this video, I think would definitely help. All right. All right. Okay. So now we're finally at Paradise Lost. Dun, dun, dun. This is the big one. So we're not going to have you read the entire story because that would be ridiculous. But there are a couple excerpts from books 1 and 4 that they're going to have you read. Now, we talked about this already with the syntax and the enjambment, but here's some more information about it. Paradise Lost, again, is considered one of the greatest works in the English language. It's supposed to be basically the Christian answer to not just the Catholic Dante's Inferno, Divine Comedy, but it's supposed to be like a modern version of an epic. So some of the works that we've studied earlier on, Beowulf, and some of the other old epic tales, this is supposed to be a modern, or at least at the time that Milton was alive, modern version of that. He wanted England to have their own epic that was sourced by someone in their country to show what their writers are capable of, that we could make long-lasting, or that they could make long-lasting literature that reflected that country's talent. And it tells the story of Adam and Eve and how they were thrown out of or were expelled from the Garden of Eden. There was a sequel, Paradise Regained, but it was not as popular. Okay, now they did give you the excerpts, so take time to read those. Pause and come back. We are in the home stretch of this lesson. We've only got a few slides left. Most of them are going to be about this work, Paradise Lost, in the excerpts here. And they pretty much give you a really big explanation. So I think you should take a look at it, open it up, try to read through it yourself. If you're having difficulty, come back here. We'll go over some of the information that's in there, and then you can go back and read it. That might help. If you're truly having a issue, like you can't get through it at all, you can't look at it, you don't know what you're looking at, then I would schedule a tutoring session. Okay. As a reminder, we're on slide 32 and we're covering Paradise Lost. So we start off with when it was written. So we have the idea of when it was written. We know that he wrote it while he was blind, right? So he went blind in 1654. Yes, he started going blind in 1652 and was completely blind by 1654. So when he wrote this was while Cromwell had died, the Commonwealth was dissolving, and Milton was losing his dream of like a Puritan run England. He had lost multiple children. He was blind, of course. And even when he would get remarried later, he, lost that wife and that child as well. So he wrote this while he was having a lot of struggles, a very agonizing time. Even though he was blind, he still composed this. So he basically was able to recite verses the way he wanted them to be written. And he had assistants that would write down what he was saying. And if he wanted to correct something, he would have them like read it back to him and he would adjust it. So this was during the time where he was starting to pull away from Protestant and Puritan beliefs. And he wasn't really a fan of the way that organized religion was affecting the country, even though he had been part of that previously. So he also has some differences from Puritans in that he believed in free will. So he didn't just think that humanity was doomed and only the chosen would go to heaven. He did think that Christians were chosen, but he thought that if you were a child of God, you could work your way into heaven by doing God's work. And this is reflected in Paradise Lost, because the importance of freely choosing to follow God's path is a major theme. So he believed that any God that makes sense would accept anyone who willingly chose to walk his path. And you can tell in Paradise Lost that Milton is trying to spread the word of being able to not necessarily create your own fate, but of God just being that merciful to people who are trying to do the right thing. And then in the second paragraph, we talk about Paradise Lost being an epic. So he modeled this idea on the earlier epics such as Homer's Odyssey and Dante's Divine Comedy, which we discussed before, which brought glory to classical Greece and Renaissance Italy, respectively. So he wanted his own version of that, but for England, especially because remember at this time, after the Restoration with King Charles II on the throne, he wanted basically for England to have a solid identity. It's very obvious from what he wrote that he supported Cromwell because he thought that doing so would finally bring England together. And that's not what happened. So he had to sort of like reflect and think and figure out what he thought would actually help. And because he was a writer, he did writing to try to achieve that goal. It says that in Paradise Lost, Milton frequently alludes to epics, so that's the Homer's Odyssey and Dante's Divine Comedy, associating them and comparing them with his own. So there's solid evidence in the text that he's trying to make this a notable epic. It says that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So the Aeonian mount refers to Helicon, which is the home of the Greek muses. So this is something that you wouldn't know unless you actually have studied Greek literature. And remember that an allusion is just a reference to things that are obvious to people at the time. So if you were educated, you knew this, you would recognize this while reading the poem. It's the same way that if you read a book now and someone references the Bible, if someone references Moses, most people know who that is and they know the story, even if they're not religious. So this is the same thing. Even if you didn't believe in the Greek mythology as like a religion or something like that, most people had read it, they were familiar with it, and they would recognize this if they saw it. So basically, what he's saying in this excerpt is that Paradise Lost contains elements never seen before in literature and will outshine, soar and above earlier epics inspired by the muses. So this is a type of boasting that usually takes place in epics. So he was trying to copy or emulate that style, because remember, this was supposed to basically be the biggest English epic. Alrighty, slide 33 talks about other things that he did to associate his works with epic works. So he starts the story in media res is one of the things. They pretty much give you a list here, so I'm just listing things off. He starts the story in media res, and then they explain what that is. In media res, it's here, written here, just so that you can see how it's spelled, is a Latin phrase that means in the middle of things. So basically, in traditional storytelling for his time, you would start a story at the very beginning and write about everything that leads up to what is happening. But when you start a story in media res, you make it obvious that things have already been happening. And a lot of the time, epics start in the middle. So you start with someone who's coming back from a journey and doesn't want to start another one, but is tempted to. You're talking about someone who um, has just finished a task for one trip and gets saddled with some other things. Like you're starting in the middle. So, for example, Beowulf starts in the middle, with Beowulf being summoned to help a group with some problems. You don't get a real like origin story for Beowulf. They tell you, like in general who his parents are, that he's an epic warrior, but you don't really get like a oh, from this day when Beowulf was born, he did blah blah blah. You don't get that. They start in the middle. Beowulf is being called, and they let you know, like, hey, he is an epic hero. He's here to defeat the monsters, and this is one of the stories of him defeating a monster. Let's go. And he does the same thing. Milton does the same thing in Paradise Lost. When Satan is introduced as a character, God has already cast him out from heaven. They give you this quote here. So you're not viewing Satan's origin story. Milton assumes everyone knows Satan's origin story. So this is just him and his Satan's influence on the Garden of Eden and how that plays out after being cast out from heaven already. You're just starting from a place where he at least felt everyone would be familiar. It says here, he also begins the poem with a request for divine guidance. So he's basically asking for heavenly guidance on being able to write this. And that's something that happens in epics. So usually in Greek mythology or other epic poems, the person will plead with the gods that they believe in for the inspiration to write a beautiful, moving story. And in this case, because he is Puritan, supporting, and definitely a Protestant, his heavenly muse isn't a Greek muse, but the Holy Spirit of Christianity. So this is literally an English Christian version of an epic. He just sort of made it his own. The excerpt they give you of him pleading is, "What in me is dark, illumine what is low, raise and support." So what he's saying here is, illuminate the parts of me that are dark and raise up the parts of me that make me unworthy to tell this story. So he's basically saying, God, I may not be good enough to tell this story, but it needs to be told. So take the parts of me that are bad and make them good enough through your grace of will that I can tell this story the way it needs to be told. So he's just using the Greek method of pleading for inspiration, but he's pleading to the Christian God for inspiration. And then we talk about themes in this last paragraph really quickly. He's retelling the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. So we already know this is a big story in the Christian religion. He's retelling one of the biggest stories. And that's part of what makes it an epic. But he also explores really big overarching ideas like free will. As we talked about earlier, he thinks that it's important to choose to follow God, not just to be born into that sort of divine right. You have to remember that Oliver Cromwell was fighting against the monarchy, who also believed that they were like chosen by the divine in their lineage to rule. So Milton's basically saying that it's not enough to just be born from a lineage that's blessed by God. You actually have to choose God for that to be meaningful. He also talks about humanity's search for redemption. And that relates to England and how things were functioning for England at the time, because they were trying to redeem themselves as a country after having Cromwell as a leader who was not king, and then reneging on that just to put a king back on the throne. And then we also talk about the battle between God and Satan. So all of these things are stuff that people could relate to at the time. Even if you're not a huge country suffering losses, most people want to be redeemed after they make mistakes. And most people kind of have an inner fight between good and evil, or God or Satan, the way it is in this book. Alrighty, slide 34. So we talk about the differences now. So here is one of the big differences between Milton's epic and normal epics. So Milton does not follow the convention of an epic hero. So in the Odyssey, we have Odysseus. In Dante's Inferno or the Divine Comedy, we have Dante. In Beowulf, we literally have Beowulf. He's a big hero. All of these are epic heroes. But Milton's main character here is actually Satan. And we get to see how flawed he is. He goes against God, obviously. He's already been kicked out of heaven. And then he plots the downfall of humankind. But because he's the main character, we're basically following the I don't want to say villain in this case, but the anti-hero. Lucifer, or Satan, is written as a being who is trying to do the right thing, but his actions and the way that he goes about it are awful and result in the fall of mankind. So he's jealous, angry, and deceitful. And he doesn't represent the ideal best version of a person in the culture. Because in an epic, that's usually what happens. The main character represents, here's what the best of us should look like, the best of us. But Satan is actually a very flawed, sort of broken version that's trying to be better and is just sort of failing all the time. So Milton portrays him sympathetically despite that, because remember, we're comparing this to England, which has clearly made mistakes in terms of who they put in management, who they put in charge, even if it's for good reasons. Cromwell wanted to reform England spiritually, but the way that he went about it, terrible. Conquering and subjugating the Irish, silencing all of his detractors. There were peaks of him wanting to do things the right way through, like, for example, him letting people worship the way that they wanted and then not forcing people to convert. But everything else that he did just was not okay. He basically became king, even though he was supposedly against kings in Britain. And even though he had what he felt were good reasons to do this, none of it turned out well in the end. So Satan is sort of a reflection of this, and also a reflection of people. That's also important. A lot of people try to do the right thing and end up messing up. So this is just supposed to reflect a lot of what humanity goes through as well. The idea is for us to see ourselves in Satan and be able to relate history and some of the decisions that we make that we know are bad to Satan's struggle to figure things out. It says here, Satan's actions are not excused, but they are explained. So there's a bit of that rationality in there and that they are explained. It says here, but his doom reserves him to more wrath, for now he thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. So basically, they're explaining why Satan felt angry at God after casting him into hell. He's not just upset about being cast out, but he's also thinking about the happiness that he lost by God deciding to cast him out. So he has to think of not just the pain he's currently in, but what he could be having if the decision was different. And that torments him. So this is thought by scholars to be a reflection of Milton's isolation and his own experience with a failed rebellion. Because remember, he was punished for supporting Oliver Cromwell. So scholars think that this affected his treatment of Satan's character, and that you can see like sort of the parallels, the connecting lines there. More importantly, having an anti-hero who was trying to do what he thought was the right thing, but not doing it in the right way, is basically what inspired the trope of antiheroes. So this isn't it fully developed, but this is uh, one of the first major portrayals of an anti-hero in an epic work like this. And this kind of inspired a lot of authors to have main characters who were not necessarily purely good in their stories. One of the examples of people that he inspired is Lord Byron. And I believe we discussed this in one of the other lessons. Lord Byron created flawed anti-heroes that were misunderstood. And they ended up being called Byronic heroes. So this portrayal of Satan is basically the blueprint for that. And that's why we're stopping here to talk about it. All right, we are in the home stretch here. We are on slide 35, and we're almost done, only a couple more slides, maybe even just one. Okay, so on slide 35, we talk about the different techniques that are used to enhance the epic feel of Paradise Lost. So we talked about enjambment, which is when you cut a sentence off to continue it on another line of poetry specifically. And then we have complex syntax, right? So that's the sentence structure being difficult because of the Latin. We talked about that. So they go on to tell you about writing in blank verse. So this blank verse were metered rhymes. So that means the lines have a syllable pattern, but the lines don't rhyme. They don't rhyme at all. And they say he uses iambic pentameter. If you are not sure what iambic pentameter means, there are slides in the English resources about it. But iambic pentameter basically says that there are 2 syllable patterns. You have a long syllable and a short syllable, I think. And then it repeats 5 times. So basically there's going to be 10 syllables in each line in that pattern. And the fact that Shakespeare wrote an iambic pentameter, he's referencing the sort of fancy or high leveled language in older poems that made them seem classic and sophisticated. So he's using that together to produce or make the same kind of sound in his poetry that you would normally have in an epic, because iambic pentameter is a really old poetic form. Remember, that's every 2 syllables have a pattern, long syllable and then short syllable, and that repeats 5 times. So that basically gives like a rhythm to the lines. Now I'm gonna read this excerpt, so hopefully you can hear the rhythm. To a far nobler shape, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor cloud, in naked majesty seemed lords of all, and worthy seemed, for in their looks divine, the image of their glorious maker shone. So he's basically using that sort of rhythm to make it seem fancier. And then he also uses bigger, fancier, sophisticated words like nobler, majesty, and glorious. And I know that you can see the difference between the spelling in some of these words and how we would you spell them today, like majesty is spelled with a Y. Just remember that this is an older form of English. Majesty, worthy, we've got seemed without the extra E. Their glorious maker shone. Shone is basically like shown, SHOWN. Something is shining, past tense is shown, right? That's just an older form of English. These days we would say shined, but it's just different. It's supposed to be formal and dignified. And it's just old English that's made to sound like older epics. Alrighty, I do think that this is the last slide. So lastly, we talk about sort of simpler devices that he uses in his text. So there are complex metaphors. So remember, metaphors are where you compare things that are not alike to try to make a connection between them for creative purposes. So just as an example, her eyes were the sea is a metaphor. You're comparing her eyes to like a body of water. Maybe that's because it's blue. Maybe that's because you're saying that you can look deep into them the same way you can the ocean. There's some sort of connection there when you have a metaphor. So keep that in mind. And it says many of these devices rely on illusions. So remember, that's references to the older things, not just to epics, but to the Bible, English literature, and other sources. So then they give you an example of this. Look at these lines in which Satan describes his plans. In them divine resemblance and such grace, the hand that formed them on their shape hath poured. Ah, gentle pair, ye little think how nigh your change approaches, when all these delights will vanish and deliver ye to woe. So he's describing in this, like in this excerpt, Satan is the narrator here, and he's describing the characteristics of Adam and Eve. So he's talking about their grace that's like beautiful, their divine resemblance. So how the hand that formed them on their shape hath poured. So he's talking about all of the traits that God, who shaped them with his hands, gave them. The hand refers to God's hand. And this is actually a special type of literary device. So because the hand is God's hand, most people who are Christian or who have heard anything from the Bible, God's hand, God's will, that sort of thing. So in this case, the hand is specifically referring to God's hand. And since you're using just his hand to refer to him, like God as a whole, that's a special type of device called a synecdoche. Synecdoche is listed here. Here's the spelling, Synecdoche. Now, synecdoche is when you use a part of something like a hand to represent the whole thing, like a person. He's referencing God's hand, but he's using God's hand to represent the idea overall. Sometimes this happens with poems where like you're referencing a ship, like maybe you reference the bow sailing on the waves. So you're referring to how it looks to see the bow of a ship on the waves, but you're using the bow of the ship to refer to the whole ship. So just to give you the formal definition so that you might have something to write down for your notes. A synecdoche is when you use a part of something like a hand to represent a whole person or idea. This also works in the reverse. If you use the whole of something to refer to a part of something, then it's also synecdoche. And it's very famous. Synecdoche also came up in our Beowulf lesson. So you might have notes on this word already, but it's here again with the explanation just in case you don't have it. And this literary device and pretty much everything else that we discussed contribute to making Paradise Lost a classic retelling of the story of Adam and Eve and humankind's search for redemption. And also, in parentheses, England's search for redemption. So on slide 37 is a lesson activity. And yep, that's the end of it. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. Cool. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I think this is the first lesson I've had to break up into 3 parts. That's kind of wild. But hopefully you were able to take breaks and actually get through it. Again, like I've said before, if you are having issues with the reading, especially with Paradise Lost, because we know it's difficult, they don't give you really big excerpts from the story, but they try to give you enough for you to try to figure it out on your own. If you're having that rough a time with it, please feel free to schedule a tutoring session with myself. My name is Amber Stokely, as a reminder, and you can also schedule a tutoring appointment with Kathy Vahovic. Soon enough, we'll be putting up readings of the excerpts to try to help you guys along. so that you have that as an extra resource. I think that that's it. I think that's it. Just as a reminder, we are only 2 lessons away from the end of the class. So the light at the end of the tunnel is there. So just hang in there, get through these last 2 lessons. It's just going to be more neoclassicism. So I'm sorry if you were hoping for something different. It definitely won't be. It's more of this and other writers that were present during this period of time. But since we got through a lot of the history, there won't be as much in these lessons. So they won't be quite as thick as this one. This lesson had 39 slides, about 40 slides. That's a very long lesson. Okay, that's it for me. That's it for this lesson. This is Miss Amber signing off. And good luck with the rest of your English class. Only 2 lessons left. Yay.